Well, I'll say I'm Angela Duckworth, and I'm really excited to be talking about a topic that I more or less think about 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. I don't know. It's hard to tell about REM sleep, but I, like many of the folks together here in this conversation, I have an obsession, and it started pretty early in my life. I grew up in a family, at least on my dad's side, that was, uh, like thinking about success and achievement a lot, talking to their kids about it a lot. And my dad, I think, bequeathed to me, therefore, a kind of a lifelong interest in like who changes the world. The people who are like the great entrepreneurs, the great civic activists, the great political leaders, the great artists, the great musicians. And when my dad talked about it, a lot of it really was about, giftedness and kind of like having that certain something, being smart. My dad really, really thought he was smart and thought that, there was a pretty strict rank ordering of intelligence in the universe. And he liked to talk about how, Einstein and Newton were like, the two redwood trees and physics. And I grew up with a common interest of my dad of achievement, but I think in a way I grew up as a little bit of a rebel, wanting to understand everything other than your innate giftedness that could explain why you made a mark in the world. And one of those things is grit. So as a psychological scientist, I have been studying grit for about 15 years. It is this combination of of passion and perseverance over really long periods, so over years, certainly when we're talking about adulthood, decades. And if you look at some individuals and you really think about like the long arc of what they're trying to accomplish in life, it's like they're in a way working on the same thing for their whole lives, or their adult lives, their adult professional lives. So it's really about stamina. It's a little bit non-intuitive in a sense, because sometimes when people think about motivation, they think about intensity, right? Like, oh my gosh, this person looks really hard. Like, oh my gosh, they pulled an all-nighter. But it's less about that. It's more about consistency and over time. So I like to think about achievement as like it's a lot like physical therapy. You don't need to do like 9 hours of physical therapy on one single Tuesday. It's more like, can you please keep doing this? And if you really do it in a dedicated way, consistently over very long periods of time, your ankle will feel better. And that I think is actually in a way harder than like these very short burst intensity bouts that are occasionally helpful too. But grit is really about the long run. It's not correlated with your IQ. It's also not correlated very strongly with your physical talents. And so it's different from the kinds of things my dad talked to me about growing up. But when you think about the people who are your heroes, your Picasso, your Maria Montessori, your Marie Curie, you're likely thinking about somebody who exemplified passion and perseverance for very long term goals, who had the stamina, who had the consistency to come back to a problem for the 19th time after 18 failures and to try it again, and then again and again. So that's what grit is. And in a way, this 15-year program of research has a 150-year past, because if you go all the way back to Charles Darwin in 1869, he was writing and debating his cousin, Francis Galton, and they were going back and forth about, innate intelligence and other factors. And Darwin said in one letter that he believed that zeal, which I call passion, and the capacity for hard labor, which I call perseverance, in his personal experience and also in his observation, made at least as important a difference as anything else, including innate intellectual ability. So that's what grit is, and that's why I study it, and that's how it's different from talent, at least talent conventionally defined. I think it's malleable, and so when I think about like why it is that I think about grit, 24/7, and why it will be my lifelong obsession, right? Like this will be the one thing I work on for the rest of my days. It's because I think you can change it, and I think if it's true of like great performers, that they're especially passionate and persevering over the long term. And if we can be a little more like them, if I could be a little more like Marie Curie, or if you could be a little more like Jeff Bezos, or or Barack Obama, or whoever it is that you really emulate, then that's a project worth, devoting all of your waking and non-waking hours to. So I do believe that it's malleable. And just to kick off conversation, I'm hoping, sorry about all the preamble, I should have had that worked out in advance, but I'm hoping in the chat you might share questions about like how you personally have questions. They could be about, things that you've heard of, or like, oh, what about atomic habits? Like whatever it is that you want to tie it to. I'm really eager for you to chat those. But I'll just begin by saying that one of the things I think that encourages grit is a growth mindset. Um, and a growth mindset is something you've probably heard about by now because it's become a pretty popular psychological idea. It's from Carol Dweck at Stanford University, and it is simply a belief that human abilities are malleable, not fixed. Fixed mindset is the opposite. A fixed mindset is a kind of belief that like really people don't change very much, um, and and there's really like severe limits on what you can do to change your personality or your abilities. I mean, Carol mostly studies beliefs about intelligence and like the belief that you can get smarter, it's growth mindset, or the belief that like that doesn't even make sense. Like, how can you get smarter? Like, yeah, you can learn things, but you can't get smarter. So the reason why growth mindset and grit are correlated, which Carol and I find jointly in our cross-sectional data, and which I have subsequently found to be kind of like virtuously reciprocally correlated. So if I measure your grit at time 1, I can predict that you will grow in growth mindset at time 2. And then I can predict from that that you will increase in grit at time 3, and that will increase your growth mindset at time 4. So there's this like upward spiral. I think the reason for these positive correlations is simply that when you believe that you can do something, you can change yourself, when you have that kind of confidence, it inclines you to be a little more passionate and persevering towards a challenging long-term goal. Then you go out and try something. You take a meeting, you send out four to 14 to 1400 emails, right? Like you get a little encouragement because somebody answers your email and takes your meeting and like says, you know what, you might have a beginning of a good idea. And that strengthens your belief that abilities can change and so forth. So growth mindset is one idea, I think, one thing that you could do, like you could work on. You could say like, oh my gosh, as she's saying that, I realize I'm kind of a fixed mindset person. Like if I inclined myself to be more of a growth mindset person, I might be a little grittier. So that's one idea, but I will maybe pause there, and then Tracy, my impromptu and generous host, maybe we can get more into conversation.
That's great. And I love that idea. And, one of our first books for the Venture Cafe Book Club this year was about growth mindset. And so that's a perfect correlation just in terms of helping people think about how they can change. Before we go to that particular subject, the theme for Venture Cafe this month is foresight. So thinking about shifting from 2020 into 21. Foresight being, how do we look ahead? How do we potentially foreshadow what we want, or project what we want? And my question really, as it relates to grit, is it something that people typically kind of approach with the mindset that they are going to do this, or does it happen over time and that they get those little carrots along the way that encourages them to kind of keep on that trajectory and keep on the path?
So one of the I think important discoveries about how people, like the technical term for this is prospection. So like if you go to Google Scholar and you look up prospection, like that's where you get like the research articles on future mindedness and future
Mhm.
time orientation and planning and goal setting and so forth. Because you could either prospect into the future or you could look backward into the past, right? That's like reflection, rumination, et cetera. And then of course there's a lot to be said about being mindful and being in the present. So essentially at any given time, your mind can be in the past, present, or future. And there's reasons why the human mind is able to do all three of those things. And so it's not like I'm saying that you should only be thinking about the future, although I think thinking about the future, prospecting into the future, is a very important part of grit. You can have another speaker come and talk about the benefits of being present in the moment, if you haven't already, which you probably have. And then, of course, there is actually some benefit if done the right way about looking backward into the past. But it is true of great visionaries and leaders that they tend to be very future oriented. And in particular, their future orientation has certain features. So there is kind of long-term vision setting, like dreaming. I mean, really like painting a picture of something that doesn't exist and is hard to imagine for most people. And those are like, grand 20-year, 30-year plans. Interestingly, if you think about the origins of Amazon.com, because you could certainly take issue with one thing or another, but it's hard to deny that Jeff Bezos has been a visionary builder. Um, and when he first was considering, URLs or domain names, I mean, like the reason why he thought, well, first of all, the reason why he chose Amazon is the longest river in the world, right? So like it was something about like, something like big, something that was going to be qualitatively different than what came before. And the alternative to Amazon.com was relentless.com, which you can type into your browser right now and see where it takes you. So this idea of, seeing very far into the future, before anybody else can see, like what would it be like to have a website where you could buy anything, right? And that it would be shipped to you within an hour. Like, it's just like, it's not something that like 25 years ago people could see.
Right.
So there is a lot of long-term vision setting, and I think this is the real surprise, is that, or not surprise, but it's important. Somehow that 20-year vision of what you are conceiving has to be matched up with what you're doing this afternoon, right? So you had to build a bridge between like your to-do list and your long-term vision. And the way I think about it is a goal hierarchy. So human beings have goals, but they're of different levels of abstraction and temporal perspective. So, I have a 30-year goal of trying to like really make headway into like the science of behavior change. But that's got to be tied into, what I do today on this Thursday afternoon. And that's a very low level, specific, concrete goal. So it's in a hierarchy. So you can imagine like a pyramid of goals where like I could write down all my to-do list goals at the very bottom, but then I have these like 2-year goals and like 10-year goals. And then I have this like vision that like maybe I'll never achieve, but it's a North Star for me. And recently there was an academic paper on John F. Kennedy and the space program, because when Kennedy said we're going to send someone to the moon, right? That was this like dream. And it also, by the way, to many people sounded impossible, right? Which is why he said we do it because it is hard, right? Not because it is easy. Um, and then he had to get like all these people at NASA to actually like execute on that, right? And so what he was able to do in very strategic ways is to give a kind of like a motivational blueprint that like made a connection between what I have to do tomorrow, what I have to do the next day, and the 1 week goals and the quarterly goals and the 2-year, right, all the way up to this long-term vision. And it's not necessarily that you can literally write it out, but having a sense that there needs to be a connection between like the things that I look ahead to very close proximally to like the very distal.
That's really fascinating. I was just talking. Go ahead, Lindsay. I think.
I have some questions in the chat. So from Nefertari, they asked, because grit, as you described, includes a degree of failure, how can grit be incorporated into the K-12 classroom where failure isn't encouraged?
So, failure is so interesting to me because, there's not a single, I think, great university, Harvard, Stanford, like Texas A&M, Duke, University of Chicago, like you can't name one that doesn't have some group of professors who are studying failure. Like literally that's all they do is study failure. I'm like, what's up with failure? Like, why is it such an important topic that like every social scientist or every department is like studying it? I think it's because human beings cannot experience failure without experiencing like a lot of emotion. And so there are all these kind of like fortune cookie aphorisms about like, fail forward, fail fast, like, the secret to success is failure. And yet the reason why it's hard to follow through on that wisdom is that it feels terrible to fail. I mean, I gave a talk a few weeks ago. I mean, I've given a lot of talks. I'm like fairly practiced at giving talks, but I gave a new talk. It was like I went out on a limb. I made an entirely new presentation. It was something that I was thinking about, I was really excited about. And I was really excited the day of the talk. And I invited like lots of really VIP people, like Nobel Prize winning people and like, people who had, federal appointments and various, things that would like change, hopefully, education for the better, et cetera. nobody from the Trump administration, but I don't want to get into politics. I'll just say that like I'm glad that the next president is different. I totally failed. I mean, it was just like a poor use of time. I didn't structure the discussion well. Like I think I came off as condescending. It was just like it was not good, and I felt terrible about it. And even though I studied failure and I studied grit, and like it felt awful. And that emotion, that charge we have when you get something wrong, when you like are told some like little piece of critical feedback that like shouldn't actually ruin your day, but does, right? The thing is that failure is a very emotional experience for everyone, and it's the only way to learn. So, like, you put those things together, and like, you have every social science department in the country studying it, right? And in terms of its practical implications for education, and frankly, for all of us, right? Because we are humans, we want to be successful. If the path to success is failure and it's very emotional, and those emotions tend to be negative and strong, like, how do we square this? One recommendation is I think actually if we shared with young people just that fact, human beings hate failing. It feels terrible. Your ego is threatened. You're defensive. You run away. You don't want to show anybody. Like just to know that, I think would normalize the experience. And I think a lot of education has to just be like elevating the metacognitive understanding around, success and failure and growth mindset, just so that like students know it's a typical reaction to have all of that, the physiology of it, the emotion of it, et cetera. And then the second thing is like I would share with students and ourselves that all of those like fortune cookie aphorisms and the all those best-selling books in the airport, like all the CEOs who tell you that like the most important thing to look for in somebody is like to make sure that they know how to fail, like it's true. I mean, it really is true. And even at the level of like learning, when students are doing things that they get 100% on and they feel really great and they hit all the right notes and it's perfect, they're not learning anything. And one of the intervention studies I did was to teach students that when they are feeling awkward, when they feel clumsy, when they feel stupid, when it's too hard, they should like give themselves a little pat on the back because they are working the way Will Smith works. They're working the way Lindsey Vonn always practiced. Like they're working the way that experts learn to interpret as good, not bad. Because I think for many students, they feel that negative emotion, they feel their palms sweating, their heart racing, and they're self-conscious and they're embarrassed. And they think, oh no, I did the wrong thing. But they need to learn that even in that presentation I did a few weeks ago, kind of stumbling and falling in front of a lot of people I wanted to impress, I learned more by trying to do something I hadn't yet done and doing it imperfectly and getting a lot of feedback about what I could do better, which I did get. I learned more than I would have if I had just like hit it, just like giving a talk on grit and like I always do. And then like everyone's happy. So there's a real trade off. So students knew A, it's normal to feel all these things and to not want to fail. And B, it's also part of how we are built is to learn from those experiences I don't think it's going to make it easy. I'm 50 years old. I've studied grit for so long and I still didn't like failing a few weeks ago, but I think it has helped me to feel like, okay, I'm going to sign up to do another talk as opposed to never signing up again to do another talk like that. And I think that's the key thing that we want students to be able to do.
And I mentor someone and she was rejected from a school for a master's. And I told her, I said, honey, I can't even tell you how many times I've been rejected. Like, you got to just keep going. And she's at Penn with a fellowship now. So, yeah.
Right, exactly. Yeah, I love hearing stories about, even talking to people who you're like, wait, what? No, it couldn't be. Like you talk to some like really eminent fill in the blank, and they're like, oh yeah, it was the only job I could get because I got rejected. Like, why am I here? Because I got rejected from all the other universities. Like, it's really great to know. And unfortunately, I think like there's a lot of we call it in psychology pluralistic ignorance. Like in other words, like it's a fact that's true, but like kind of nobody knows, right? But I'm at Penn. I tried to get a job at Temple, and they didn't even like give me an interview. So like, so I'm at Penn, but like wasn't good enough for Temple. So like, like it, and I learned from it, and like, it was okay, and the world didn't end. So yeah, I'm glad you're telling your the person you're working with about that.
And then I have a question from Ken. He's saying, he's asking, how can you measure grit? It seems like an intrinsic quality.
So, if we had more time, Ken, I might ask you about the word intrinsic, which can mean many things. But sometimes when you talk about like, oh yeah, it seems like an intrinsic quality, it could mean, and I don't think you mean it this way, but like, oh, it's like not something you can change. I don't think that's what you mean because you were asking about measurement. But like, I often talk to people who are like, yeah, but you can't really change that. And like I said at the beginning, um, I I'm not saying that we can all wake up tomorrow and be Michael Jordan, but I do think that we can change. And by the way, we can watch and learn from Michael Jordan and do a few things that he did and begin to be more like, Michael Jordan in the ways that we want to be, potentially. In terms of measuring it because it's intrinsic, I think you mean intrinsic, not in that sense, but more in like it's kind of like inside you. So like how would you, count it, or like, what's the way you can quantify it, especially if you want to build a team or a company that's gritty. So I don't know. I mean, the short answer is I don't know. Here's my worst idea and here's my best idea. The worst idea, something I don't want you to do, is to give the grit scale, right? Which you can Google. It's free. It's on my website. Whatever. Like you can go to Character Lab, and we have like a grit playbook, and there's some questions for self reflection. Those are really either for research, which means that like when you use a really large sample and there's no incentive to fake, like it can be helpful, or for self-reflection. Like you read these questions and it just gives you something to think about. You're like, oh yeah, my interests really do change all the time. Like, why is that? Right? That's not useful for hiring. So that's a worst idea. Don't do that. Here's my best idea, which is I think that if somebody really has passion and perseverance for long-term goals, if that's a tendency that they have at that point in their lives, developed, then you should be able to see it in what they have recently done. I would look for multi-year commitments with progression. So that looks like a resume where, for example, if somebody's even just like a new hire, like maybe they did a sport for like, 2 or more years, and they really progressed. And like, I'm not saying that they won an Olympic medal, but like you could see there's progression. So I think the idea that I have is that you look for evidence of that. And by the way, interviews, are closer to what I think of the worst idea than they are to the best idea. Because in an interview like this, you're getting a little more about social intelligence and, the ability to tell a story, et cetera. Those are not the same thing as grit. And there are people who are exceptionally gritty, who are going to come back every day and just like and be at it, even if they had a really bad day the day before, who are not going to present super well in interviews, who aren't going to be super charismatic, et cetera. So, worst idea to best idea, and, look at those resumes and don't just kind of look at them and be like, oh, but look for a pattern of sustained engagement and some progression.
Thank you. And I have one. I'm just going to keep rolling with them, if that's okay.
Yeah.
And I have one of my own too. I'm waiting to get to everyone else's. So Joe is asking, and I love this question, do you practice any type of journaling or writing plans to track your progress towards goals and ensure you're being consistent?
I've been thinking about writing and journaling, in part because, as some of you probably are reading Matthew McConaughey's recent like memoir slash self-help book. I think it's called Green Lights, and it's #2 on Amazon's best-selling list. So he says basically he's like a lifelong journaler, right? And it's like, this is kind of like the result of all those pages of reflection. There's a scientific literature on journaling, like it's called expressive writing, and it has these kind of like miraculous effects. Like for example, when you write about trauma, or actually if you also, there's a separate literature on writing about good things, right? Like you can journal about good things, you can journal about bad things. It's all good. There's something about writing, and I don't think scientists have fully like understood what is it that happens when we write that is so helpful. I wrote a lot in a journal. I kept a journal every day for like all of college and well beyond. Now, because my whole life with work is actually like writing, for like I send out a weekly 60-second essay called My Tip of the Week. If you want it, you can go to characterlab.org, or somebody can chat it, which would be great. Like that is my journal, right? So it's like, I think I have, it's like morphed into more public journaling, but I strongly recommend it. I do think that there's something about the distance that we can have to reflect, and to also, most human memories are terrible. Like if you couldn't like take notes and write things down, like it's like by the time you get to the like the you know the next thought, like you're like, oh yeah, what was the first thought? So writing is both extension of your memory and also a little bit of psychological distance that really helps you, I think, reflect and put things together. So I highly recommend journaling as a habit.
And then we have a question from Ellen. She's asking, how has COVID impacted your personal level of grit? If it made it higher, what inspired that? If it made it lower, what are you doing to raise it back to its baseline?
COVID has like the 2020, wow, what a year. And I think one thing we can say confidently about this year is that it really has influenced everybody in a different way. So in a way, we're all going through a global pandemic, like us, and then everyone around the world. So in some ways, it's a shared experience, and also it's incredibly like you may or may not have somebody in your own personal life who has passed away from COVID. You may or may not have lost income from like your venture dreams may or may not have been like dramatically influenced by COVID. More likely yes than no on that one. So I don't want to generalize at all from my experience. And by the way, being a professor is like already being quarantined. I mean, like, I don't know, it's like, oh, you just like sit in a room and you're mostly interacting with human beings through occasional calls. Like that's kind of what I did before. So for me personally, it's been professionally not that different. But I will say this from like a social science perspective, which might be helpful for understanding the effects of events like COVID on development and your own response. First of all, you should all know that the most common human response to challenge, difficulty, and even trauma is actually resilience. Resilience is not the exception; it's the rule. So, like most people, like have like at least as high functioning after a traumatic year like 2020 as they did before. Not everyone, but most. And it might just be comforting. It doesn't mean that it's not terrible in the moment, but you should just know that you're likely a resilient person, statistically speaking. The second thing, in terms of really growing from it, there's a little bit of controversy. Scientists disagree. But I think that I would say that challenges with support can be very developing. In other words, like something terrible happens to you, like you have a bad talk, or you get sick, or somebody you really love like is no longer in your life, and that is traumatic or challenging. In the absence of support, I think that can be just debilitating. But in the presence of support, we can often find ways to learn and grow from them. So that means that I hope for each and every one of us on this call that there is, in particular, social support, like people who really care about you, like a best friend, a cousin, your mom, like a romantic partner, an old boss who like somehow still cares about you, like those things I think make it so that when we confront challenges in our life, that they don't wound us in ways that we can never recover from, but in some cases, like and then maybe in all cases, help us learn something, and in many cases leave us with you know improved character or more wisdom.
And I find that interesting because I read an article recently about elderly and how they are not experiencing heightened levels of depression, which was unexpected. But the scientists concluded that it was because they have a resiliency that they've built up through their lives. And that's why they're not experiencing heightened depression.
That's
So
very interesting. Yeah, I did not read that article yet, but that sounds, yeah, it's like something I should read.
it's just something I stumbled upon. I wish I could give it to you, but I don't know where it is.
Gone back into cyberspace.
And I have a question. So I read your book. I love your book. I consider myself a naturally, I've been told I'm very tenacious and I have resiliency. And I feel like your book was like an advertisement for me. So I wish all my future employers will read it and I can say, hey, like I have that. My question to you is, do you think that there is a certain kind of level of like madness or insanity that goes with being gritty, with having grit? Because I feel like a lot of the times it feels that way because you feel like you get like pushed down, but then there's like this thing in your mind that just tells you that you're going to keep going even though you don't want to.
Is there like one story that you might be willing to share of a time where you kind of had the like I'll show you response to like being pushed down or told you couldn't do, or discouraged in some way?
Yeah, so just I worked full time to put myself through college and I graduated and then I walked and everything. And then I got a contact from Temple University saying that someone messed up my transcript and I had to take 2 more credits. So I went and I took 2 more credits over the summer. And after I took those credits, the professor did not put the grades in. And they told me that since they didn't put the grades in, I'm not going to get my diploma. So I allowed myself to cry for like a day. And then just in my mind, I just envisioned myself like climbing up this mountain, and that I had tools to climb up, and I lost my tools. So I was climbing with my nails, and then my nails were ripping off, and I was just going up this mountain no matter what. And I wrote a letter, and I ended up getting my diploma mailed to me in like 3 weeks.
That's a very gritty story. I love that story. Yes, I think in a way you could argue there's something where you're like, wait, why is this person doing this, against the odds thing? Or like you can easily imagine an alternative, which is like, oh, okay, I guess it's not possible, right? And it is definitely a common response among the people that I study as being like sort of paragons of grit, that when discouraged, when kind of given like reason to quit, they double their motivation. They're like holding on tighter, right? Instead of like loosening their grip and then giving up. And I call it the I'll show you response. I remember reading Becoming by Michelle Obama when it came out, and she describes being told by her guidance counselor, just thinking about college, and she's like, Princeton. The guidance counselor was like, yeah, no, not Princeton. And she was like, all I could feel was this like a hot anger. I'll show you. I think it's like in italics. And I was like, yeah, they're literally what I hear these, grit paragons say. It's like, it's instinctive and it's very fast. It's kind of like, not like you think about it. You're not like, I'll show you. No, it just happens like in a burst of fury. And the question in my mind is like, why did they respond that way while other people have the a response was like, I'll give up, right? What's the difference between I'll show you and I'll give up? Like what happens in one person's mind that doesn't happen in the others? I think it comes down to confidence. I think at some point that, or maybe gradually in life, some people develop a kind of confidence where when someone says to them like, yeah, I don't think you've Princeton, no, not for you, like their confidence roars and says like, no, I can do it, I'll show you. Whereas another person's like, yeah, you're probably right. Like, like I'm reaching too high. Then that leads you as a psychologist to ask, well, where's the confidence come from? And just to give a short answer to something that could go on forever, I've been recently talking to Al Bandura about this very topic. Al Bandura is the most cited living psychologist ever. He's like, yeah, at Stanford, he's in his 90s. And he did the path-breaking work on confidence, or he calls it self-efficacy, like the belief that you can do something if you try. And in our very recent conversation, meeting like last weekend, we talked about success and failure, which we just talked about a moment ago, right? And he recognizes that you have to fail to be successful, of course. But I asked him, like, can confidence come from like success and failure equally? Like, what do you think? And I think what, just to paraphrase Dr. Bandura, is that it is the accumulation of small wins, in one way or the other, like these encouragements that we get that actually does build our self-efficacy. So while we tell our kids that, it's important to learn to fail, like, success is like through the path of failure, learning requires failure. At the same time, you have to recognize that it's the successes and not the failures that develop that confidence. So I don't want to see school children or human beings around the world fed 100% diet of failure, because then nobody would have confidence. Nobody would ever say, I'll show you. There has to be a sequence of events in our lives where we stumble a little bit, but we teach ourselves to get up again. And then we hear applause at some point. I think that in the right way, praise is important. Praise can go wrong in life, but I have said to certain students in my class, you know what? I've seen a lot of kids like you, and I see great things in your future. You are a good person. You are going to do something that is going to change the world, because I know that they need that confidence so that when something happens where they're like, oh my gosh, maybe I can't, they'll say to themselves like, yeah, I can, I'll show you. So I think that your story is a great illustration of how this, maybe for you it came very early, maybe there was a genetic advantage there, but I think we can begin to get onto the path of like small wins that builds our confidence. And then when we're really challenged, we'll hear ourselves say something that is affirming, as opposed to, like kind of capitulating.
It just feels like absolute insanity sometimes though, because like even when I'm like feeling like crap and I just want to eat some ice cream and watch TV, there's like a thing in my brain that's like, you're just gonna wake up and you're just gonna start again tomorrow. And I feel like I'm like, I know, but like right now I seriously just want to chill and watch some Gilmore Girls. Okay.
Well, I think it's important to know, like, you obviously have a good perspective on it. You're like, it's kind of like a crazy person. I mean, I sometimes think about myself and I'm like, I guess I am a little bit of a crazy person, right? Like I work 7 days a week. Like 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 that's just like weird, right? Like, or it is a little nuts. Or you're kind of like, wait, why do you want to? But um, here's another, like, I'll just share like of my deep seated, view of human nature is that, like, from where we sit in our shoes and our view of the world and our life experience, like we're all sane. It's just like, like from sometimes we have enough perspective to be like, yeah, I guess from the outside this looks a little nuts or different, but like, but people are sane. And even when my students, when I used to be a high school teacher, when it drove me crazy, and I'm like, you're doing things that are like irrational. Actually, if I had the empathy to see things from their perspective, through their eyes, standing in their shoes, and with their life experience, I bet everything would make sense to me. It's just that like I couldn't, get there from where I was because I didn't have enough empathy. But anyway, I'm sure you're not insane.
And when you said that you tell kids like, I see a lot in you, I pretended that you were saying that to me, so thanks. And I have a question from Stephanie. She says, when you are making a long-term plan, are success and failure equal in the eyes of grit, or is there a better way to respond to failure that will motivate you to be grittier in the long run?
So when you're making a long-term plan, I mean, by the way, try to be successful, right? The failure is not like something that I plan, in advance. Like, I think I'm going to give a terrible talk, and then like I'll be embarrassed in front of like a lot of people that I really care about, and then I'll learn from it. I actually planned to give a successful talk. Like I tried to do my best. So plan for success. Obviously, it's just that learn from the failures as take every day as data. Like at the end of every day when you're writing in your journal, which we all establish is a good habit, like if it's a good day, you can learn something from it. And if it's a bad day, you can learn something from it. So, but don't plan to have bad days, right? Obviously. I don't think you were intending that in any way. I think that like one of the big findings in the management literature is by these two psychologists named Locke and Latham, and they published everything together. So all these like Locke and Latham papers, and sometimes Latham and Locke papers. But one of the things that they found is that setting specific goals that are like challenging but feasible. So they have to be like within striking range, like, so like me planning to be Michael Jordan is not a feasible goal. So it's too challenging, right? But it is specific, so that's good. So when you think about that, like, for example, I'm teaching a class right now, right? And I have ratings for every class. And like I know what my numeric rating was from the last class, and I know what the student said. It's a challenging but feasible goal to try to get it up, like, by like 5% from the last thing, right? It's not a feasible goal to be like overnight I want it to go like this. So I think as you're setting goals and making long-term plans, if you can keep in mind specific goals are better than vague goals. So really saying like I want to be up 5% is better than being like, oh, I want it to go up, right? If you have a fitness goal, saying like, you know what, I want to start exercising 3 days a week instead of 2 days a week is better than like I should work out more, right? So specific is better. And then it should be challenging but not impossible. So it's got to be like the Goldilocks. It can't be like something you can already do. It can't be something that's impossible, but it should be like outside of your comfort zone a little bit. And actually, I think that's the way children naturally are. If you look at like 2-year-olds and 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds and 5-year-olds, they're always trying to do things that are like they're like dropping things or whatever. But they're always trying to like stretch to the just the next. It's called the zone of proximal development by a child develop psychologist. The zone of proximal development is just it's a stretch. But again, as adults, we can also set specific goals. So specific and just challenging enough is the way I would recommend.
So I'm going to jump in and ask a question, which is Venture Cafe. The theme is innovation is for everyone. Do you believe that grit is capable? Like everyone is capable of grit?
Well, just to connect it to innovation, Friedrich Nietzsche, the German philosopher who, among other things, said, "What doesn't kill me makes me stronger." Right. So Friedrich Nietzsche I had a debate actually, and if anybody wants to look this up, it's in his book, Human, All Too Human. But Nietzsche, one of the greatest, most famous philosophers ever, was having a debate with his friend or ex-friend. Anyway, they were like frenemies, Wagner. And Wagner thought that like innovation and creativity and artistic genius were like kind of like divine and like a muse hits you and it's like inspirational. And Nietzsche was like, no, it's hard work. It's just like it's like you work at something, you work at something, you work at something, you work at something, and then like at some point people are like, oh, it's so creative and innovative, but like really there was a real craftsmanship and a kind of like like almost a mundanity, some scientists would call it, like to the eventual cycle. And I think Nietzsche was right. And I think that it's not to say that there is like that grit is the same thing as creativity, but I think when you look at really original ideas, like very often it's because the person has been so into it and they know all the ins and outs, like, and that's where the inspiration comes from. It's like, oh, who thought of making a knife sharpener that way? It's like, well, an outsider who doesn't work with knives or magnets or like he's not going to think about that, right? It's like so there is, I think, a large part of creativity which comes from grit that is enabled by like dedication to a craft and like really knowing something and knowing it to its nuances and then knowing it more and thinking about it more. And then in terms of like, is that accessible to any of us? Is innovation and is grit and their intersection, are they accessible to us? Yeah, I mean, I'm a growth mindset person, and I think that you know uh like there's enough evidence that people can learn and grow. Like therapy works, for example. Like what is therapy except for personal development, right? Like, and it works. Like there are random assignment, placebo controlled longitudinal studies. Therapy works. Okay, well, if therapy works, then like could reading books work? Could like listening to podcasts work? Could like writing in your journal work? And you know I would like there to be more evidence, but like the preponderance of evidence to me suggests like personal development is possible. So you might not wake up tomorrow and ski like Lindsey Vonn or like, play basketball like Michael Jordan, but like, could you over time become a more optimistic person? Could you over time become a more creative person? Could you over time be better at handling failure? Could you over time be more empathic? Yes.
That's great.
And I have a question in the chat that I think is very similar to what you're talking about. So it's from Mina, and she's asking if you see any patterns or correlations between background and how one was raised and grit.
The parenting literature. So when we think about background, of course, that can mean many things. Your socioeconomic status. My parents immigrated from China. It could be that. It could be your race. I'm Asian by ethnicity. Like it could mean lots of things. But one thing I'll just foreground, because I think it cuts across cultural and socioeconomic lines, is parenting style. So generally, there is actually a better parenting style. Like there is a best parenting style. And it is this. It is parents who are supportive as opposed to non-supportive, right? And that means like they're warm and they're they really respect their kids and their autonomy, and they're like if your kid comes home and has like a different view about sexuality or politics than you do, that you really respect them and allow them to have their own opinions. So this, that's support. And then there's being demanding. So there's like basically holding kids to higher standards and asking them to do things that they can't yet do, and like giving them a little negative feedback when they don't write a thank you note and they really should have, or they were dishonest and you need to give them a lecture on cheating. And like so this combination across culture and across context has been shown to be the best, like sort of for everything, including grit. And there is research showing that kids who are gritty tend to have had parents who are this combination of supportive and demanding. But it's just also true of kids who are healthy and kids who are doing well academically and kids who are socially well adjusted. So as you think about your parenting or as leaders, the same observation has been made of organizations. You want a CEO and a founder who is supportive. They respect you. They respect your independence, your autonomy. They're warm toward you. They really care for you, and they're demanding. And you don't want a leader who is like one but not the other, or neither.
And I have a question. I saw It was from, I think it was from Penn. It was a survey to get an estimate of people's level of grit. Are you behind that?
I don't know, but like I, try to put the things that I do, and I try to get other scientists to put it on characterlab.org. So it's like free, and it's mostly designed for parents and educators. But I find a lot of like CEOs and leaders end up like printing things, and parenting and leadership have a lot in common. So I don't like send surveys out myself that I know of, but maybe somebody's like circulating some of that stuff.
And
Um,
then I have a question from Nefertari, and they asked, when you look back at your career, when did you realize I've arrived?
um, well, I will say this, it was good to be able to keep my job. So, when I was on tenure track, being a professor, who, like, if some of you know, like, you start off as an assistant professor, and then there's this like moment in time where it's like you either get your job forever or like you get kicked out. And so I was happy to not lose my job. So I did feel like a certain arrival when that, sorry, um, I'm on like a call, just so you know. And my husband's here. He's also on a call. I'm gonna try to get him to leave the house. Um, but I will say this: the thing that I really admire about the people that I study is they never feel like they've arrived. They really never did. If you watch videos of Kobe Bryant and like how he, like, his attitude, it really was. You want this? You want the black one? He needs a cord. um, it was amazing to me that he never wanted to feel like he arrived. He never wanted to like rely on his past achievements or his talent. He's like, I always want to be the hardest working person on the court, like every day, every practice. And I recognize that pattern a little bit in myself, and definitely in the people that I study. They're not like they're like the opposite of complacent. And Lindsay, you might say like, oh yeah, it might seem like a little bit of insanity, but like, yeah, from the outside maybe, but like they're never like, oh, okay, now I can relax. I think they also feel like, Brian Grazer said recently, he's a paragon of grit and a Hollywood producer. I think he has like more Oscar nominations than like any other Hollywood producer or something like that. And he was like, I am comfortable being uncomfortable. Like that's the only comfort I have, is to be outside my comfort zone.
So one of the questions we like to ask folks who've come to Venture Cafe, and we genuinely believe everybody has one, is what's your superpower? So it doesn't have to be that you've overcome. What's your superpower? What has propelled you to success, despite the fact that you think that you can continue to achieve levels of success that you haven't yet achieved?
Yeah, you can have a growth mindset about your superpower, right? Yeah. So yeah, I think I probably have like two things that have really served me well. One is writing. Like I really, really love words. I love words. I'm like, I just finished Arthur Ashe's memoir, and it's called Days of Grace. Um, it's like beautifully done. Like when I like read it, it's like I can hear his voice. It's like I love words. I love Charlotte's Web. Like I really love writing. And so as a psychologist, it's like, well, what does it matter if you can write well? It's like, well, actually it turns out it can help you a lot, because like people will like read the article you wrote instead of like not read the article you wrote. And so often when I'm in a team, like I feel like in the team, there's somebody whose superpower is statistics. There's another person whose superpower is like, and like usually the person like, the power that I'm supposed to draw on in my collaboration is like the writing part. So writing has served me well. I had a really great high school English teacher named Mr. Carr, and he like taught me to love words. And I think like I owe like much of my career to him. And the second superpower that has served me well is, I am my mother's daughter. So if you had my mom on, who's 85, like she really likes people. Like she just is really like, like if you like met her today and then said like, can I have everything you own? She would be like, okay. Like she just really likes people. And I think I am my mother's daughter in that, like, I really like my students. I really, have enjoyed this conversation. Like I think in a way like that has helped me, to, develop mentoring relationships with, people that I really admired. And the combination of being a decent writer and like, reasonably good at like connecting with people because I like them, has helped me like be a better psychologist in ways that were probably not predictable.
That's great. Thank you.
And I have a silly question. Do you have any thoughts on the Philadelphia mascot Gritty?
I have nothing to do with Gritty. However, I think it's like amazingly successful. The mascot Gritty. Like I think it's like the only mascot that made like the cover of the New York Times and People magazine. Like it's like, why does everyone love Gritty? I don't know. I had nothing to do with it. No royalties. I don't really even understand Gritty. I'm like, what is this mascot? But I don't understand any mascot. So no, I remember the day that Gritty came out, and I was like, wow, that is so bizarre. How many of these t-shirts am I going to get in the mail? And the answer is so far none. So I wish the flyers well, and grit's a good word.
And he has a girlfriend now in the UK. Yes.
Really?
I forget her name, but it's horribly great. She wears like
Oh
a
my God, that's so funny. So Gritty's having a transatlantic romance.
Which will be
That's
par
really
for the course in 2020.
Yeah, they're doing everything on Zoom and texting probably. Good for them.
Well, and so I think we're going to wrap up here because we're coming to the hour. So, Angela, I wanted to thank you so much for answering the questions and being so open and giving us insight into your experience and working with grit. And I wanted to let everyone know that there is a next session coming up. So, I'll put a link in the chat if you are interested in going to that. And I want to thank everyone for being here and sharing their questions.
Thank you. I've really enjoyed this, and thank you for having me at Venture Cafe. It's been an honor.
Thank you, Angela.
All right, everyone take care. Be safe.